district court judge considers the question of Google's search engine monopoly. Dominic Cummings gives an interview to Sky News. The FCC, Farm Credit Canada, earmarks $2 billion for investments in Canadian agrotech, and some analysts argue that private equity is to blame for your underperforming pension funds. Welcome to Radical Priorities. I'm Aidan Clark.
I'm Ben Parkins.
So Google, who has had this strong grasp on public search engines for the last 20 years. I mean, they built really, the modern search engine, and they've had in effect a monopolistic control.
Mm.
It's just funny that one of the defenses that they give, and it's a very difficult question in some respects, though it's, I think, fairly obvious to everyone in a more intuitive sense that they have some kind of monopoly. And how can you not have a monopoly? But there's so little understanding of how all of these tech companies are basically monopolistic. If you consider them through the lens of economics, what you really need to do is consider them through the lens of public infrastructure. And then you'll see that, just trying to, for instance, introduce competition, not really the point. It's an answer in a standard economic sense, but the point is, oh, we don't want public infrastructure in private hands.
Right, of course. I mean, my understanding is that Google has sort of over the years been embroiled in a number of kind of antitrust laws and cases, but they're just kind of so technical and the process is so long that it's never really come to fruition. But yeah, I know that there is some talk. We talked about Yanis a lot in the last episode, who's spoken about the idea of a Google search as basically a human right at this point, or access to the internet as something as basic as water, food, and housing. And so yeah, I think it's important for us to think about it in that way. I mean, it almost seems, progressive and good to be championing the idea of, yeah, we need to break up these tech companies. But the idea of sort of breaking them up into smaller pieces of, still something that, like you said, is in private hands to me, doesn't feel particularly progressive, especially as we see sort of weird, Twitter has its own AI and Google's incorporating AI and Musk is involved in OpenAI. He helped found it, but now he's suing them. All of these really sort of weird pieces that all move around. It doesn't seem to be the sort of transformational policy that maybe some people would think it is on the surface.
It's also interesting that, part of Apple's defense, Google's defense rather, is there's AI now, and people are using it as if it's a search engine. And in fact, many people will pull up the ChatGPT app instead of the Google, or Safari uses Google as well. So whatever they're using, but it's all
Mhm.
based largely on the Google search engine. It's funny that they would say, well, look, there's already effectively, market competition between search engines themselves and artificial intelligence, which is a really interesting and slightly clever way of describing how there is effectively competition. Of course, it is true that there's a conflict between these two things. Traditional, let's call it again, public internet infrastructure is being replaced by artificial intelligence, which isn't really public infrastructure. It's a way of using public infrastructure to continue doing economics by another means, accelerating the capacity for for commercial activity, transactions, or even labor, everything to take place. So that's definitely a conflict. But it misrepresents the extent to which our solution, I think, as you're getting at, is to come up with a progressive vision of this public infrastructure in the first place. And on that subject, I think that, the funny thing about human rights is obviously that was a great philosophy, shall we say, for neoliberal economics, for the post-war world as a whole. We came up with frameworks as a response, yes, to the war, but also we wanted new forms of economic stability. We wanted, what was the world the Americans were going to build after defeating the Nazis and saving Europe? And they built tons of institutions, and human rights was a philosophy that was associated in part of those institutions, which include, institutions like the IMF, to the United Nations, to the World Bank, to the World Trade Organization, for a time Bretton Woods, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think human rights is going to cut it, though, of course, the spirit of Varoufakis's point I agree with. But what we lack right now is a system for being able to install and implement a search engine as a right. We don't really understand why it would be a right, and we certainly don't have the society that could make it available as a right.
So it's interesting because we were talking about Yanis because he had spoken at the Qatar Economic Forum, which Elon Musk also spoke at, and they actually kind of shared this view of the internet as something really fundamental to humanity at the moment. The interviewer basically posed the question as, doesn't it represent a conflict of interest that you have all these private businesses, but now you have a role in government? Um, and she was sort of specifically talking about how Elon wants to get Starlink, his internet company, into as many countries as possible. Um, and he kind of deflected, and he had some good answers to how it didn't represent a conflict of interest. He spoke about how the fact that he's in an advisory role, the president doesn't have to do what he says, all these things. Um, but he basically said that it's going to be really important for everyone to have access to fast, reliable internet. And his response was basically that with the internet you can learn any skill, you can teach yourself anything, you can become well educated no matter where you are if you have access to the internet and something that can connect to the internet. Now, obviously, he wants to do this in the private way, right? So he thinks that Starlink is the best, offers the fastest speeds for the best price. There will be market competition. We'll win out. This is the way. Um, but I do think he's correct that it's really fundamental at this point for people to have access to the internet. And I think that being able to learn things is a huge part of that. I don't think that I see it in the same way that he probably does, which is that anyone can teach themselves to become an entrepreneur. We can have a whole new generation of entrepreneurs, and then those people will solve the problems that humanity is facing through leveraging AI and the software as a sales sector of technology. But it was kind of interesting to see, yeah, sort of both of these people on two very, very different ends of the spectrum, kind of advocating for the same thing in principle. But again, not necessarily, as you said, providing sort of a new way of thinking that would even posit the internet as a basic human right, or what a basic human right, should now be considered, now that it's not something like food or shelter, water, and is in fact something like access to the digital.
Dominic Cummings gave an interview to Sky News. I haven't really seen him in the news at all. In fact, not in years. He left Boris Johnson's government in 2021 during a variety of pandemic scandals, but also effectively on the basis that he very much disagreed with Boris Johnson's ultimate way of administering what was meant to be Brexit. And then again, the pandemic hit. But Dominic Cummings, of course, was the architect of Brexit and pioneered all kinds of interesting political innovations and political philosophy to see Brexit both advocated for and eventually installed. But of course, in a sense, as a legal and political project, it kind of collapsed. And yet he nonetheless led Boris Johnson to a majority, a Tory majority in 2019, a couple of years later, on the basis of change and let's hold firm to this what Dominic Cummings called this great exercise of democracy. But it was a very interesting interview. In a sense, Cummings is kind of repeating his taglines. He doesn't regret Brexit, and spend actually most of the interview trying to explain the structure of government in the United Kingdom. And I think in so many ways it reflects all of government right now, the gridlock of government. Um, for Cummings, his frustration is with Whitehall, right? The sort of bureaucratic arm, as it were, which vastly and dramatically overdetermines what occurs in Westminster and sort of the House of Commons. And he even sort of says, look, there are scripts that ministers, elected ministers, read out at these kind of official cabinet meetings, but that it's actually people like the cabinet secretary, who are in charge of making the final decisions that government makes, because it's not really, at the end of the day, a Westminster or ministerial affair. It's such a logistical nightmare to coordinate any part of the British economy from the perspective of the government for a variety of reasons. Uh, Mainly to do, I would say, or at least there's a lot to do with how reduced the role of government has actually become. It's a funny sort of paradox we see in political philosophy right now, right? We don't trust government because it doesn't have the resources to do anything. So of course it can only do a poor job. And even Dominic Cummings, who's a great skeptic of government and a big supporter of markets, free markets, and using the government to an extent as a procurer for things like science and technology and blah blah blah. But even he said, look, there was this, from Sunak's government to now with Keir Starmer's, there's this kind of, whether it's on the subject of immigration or in particular the subject of the NHS, there's this kind of void of policy, this void of any governmental concept for what to do. And I think, in view of our discussion about the internet and AI, one has to ask, well, what would a really good government look like right now? What is an efficient government? What's a sort of operationally functional government? For Cummings, it's obviously get the government as little involved as possible in the mechanics of the markets. Government can kind of help push this certain things that way, and it's an exercise in democracy. It's an exercise in political representation. That's the core of government. It shouldn't necessarily move beyond that, and we shouldn't necessarily have these hyper technocratic, bureaucratic institutions. But again, these institutions sort of exist there almost because of the free fall, in a sense, of when you try to rein in commercial activity, right? You can't do it. Any interruption of commercial activity, whether it's on a democratic basis or not, right? So even a great exercise in democracy like Brexit will contradict the very features of market society that make sure housing is affordable, or bananas are affordable, regardless of whether the market can actually accomplish anything like affordability, right? As long as the debt system continues, people don't particularly care about what the prices are. Only the ministers and prime ministers have to face the fury of the people, and there's always this gap. Like there's this gap between how much longer can this administration last before rising housing prices or failing public institutions or public services will result in them being chucked out. But very few people want to ask the question that Dominic Cummings is asking about bureaucracy and about this fundamental, almost conceptual failure of government that even Cummings himself, I would argue, misses this. The fact that government right now, almost in the internet world and increasingly with an AI world, it hasn't also contributed this progressive vision that we were just talking about. And therefore, they have no answer to markets, right? We're not in the era of social democracy. We're not in the era of, negotiating labor and capital, right? Because even those markets have been vastly transformed and vastly financialized. And with AI, as we've seen, wage and taxation contracts are just going to completely break down, and therefore the concept of government revenue will break down. So, in some respects, I would say the only response to Dominic Cummings' skepticism, which is a very justified and valid skepticism, is to say, okay, but hold on. This is not necessarily the job for markets, right? This is, you know, a job for rethinking why market society maybe has reached the point where it's no longer useful for us and can't necessarily solve this problem. And we just kind of keep having democratic crisis after democratic crisis. And also how exactly the government could be shaped in the image of something like the internet.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is what we talk about, quite often. We fundamentally return to this like kind of strange struggle that we see all the time between things like the central bank and Wall Street and the free market capitalists and government. I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that with the rise of AI, you also see a figure like Elon Musk come in and talk about, Doge, about how the government should be hyper efficient and finding all of this waste and doing all these things in these interesting ways. And of course, occupying, like the interviewer at the forum said, sort of a strange hybrid role of, literally the richest person in the world owns more businesses, wide reaching sort of tentacles of business empire. But then, of course, as a government advisor in this way. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think for the average person, fundamentally, there used to be this idea that, government, or at least a social democratic government, was sort of meant to negotiate between business, who we kind of knew was wanting to screw you over, and what the people actually needed and sort of wanted. Then of course there's sort of a turning point, towards the 70s and 80s, where we start to think of almost a government. I think the famous phrase is sort of government is the shadow that big business casts. They're often operating in their interests. I mean, business basically just got larger than government, to the point that that negotiation was no longer between sort of two equals. With pandemic, though, you see something interesting, which is that the government actually does have sort of an absurd amount of power. They were able to shut all of these things down and negotiate in this really kind of crazy, intense way. Obviously, we see the inflationary effects of the slowdown mixed with the government spending that was caused by the pandemic. Um, but yeah, it's interesting to sort of think about it in this way. I mean, I'm happy that he's asked the question. I think we would, as we said, have very different responses. But when you look to something like the internet, I mean, we mentioned it months and months ago. But Wab Canoe in Manitoba, announced that to combat these long waiting times and the inefficiencies of the provincial healthcare system, that the government of Manitoba had basically made an app for people to book appointments and to schedule appointments or move them in ways that were so much more efficient to help with these waiting times. And I just thought that that was so incredible and so forward thinking. I mean, we've sung his praises quite a bit. He's also just great, in general at the digital. He's got a great TikTok presence, but I think that that's reflected in how progressive the policy is. Where, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what most people would say is, why do I not get access to healthcare through an app? Now, obviously, if you've ever used a private healthcare app, to get access, something like Maple or whatever, they're horrible, and they're kind of following the techno feudal business model, which is that they really just charge rent for the service of connecting you to a healthcare professional in this way. Um, but yeah, I think that that's a totally reasonable question. Why do I not get access to my socialized healthcare through a socialized healthcare app? And it's really great to see a politician say, "Yeah, I agree. Why don't you? Let's try it. Let's do it." I don't think the app has been out long enough for us to see the effects, but I wouldn't be surprised if it works very well.
What's also interesting is that the quote unquote economics of an app like that, and to Varoufakis's argument, is that you're no longer paying that rent which you mentioned. And in this sense, it's also, it's a political tool. It means that you're addressing what we discussed last episode, is those excessive imbalances, right? Governments have these impossible budgets. They can't. Their job, actually, for generations, has been to maintain and produce, or generate, in a sense, a political consensus for allowing our monetary system to be nothing, a giant debt system for the sake of the movement of capital, for the sake of investment. And what's interesting with the 1970s, since you brought it up, is it wasn't, not only did, in a sense, business get very big, but business also kind of, I would also argue that business ran out of steam. Industrial business ran out of steam. There was such a conglomeration of interests, that the next step was to make a business of conglomeration itself, which is, of course, what happens in the financialized era. And there was also a slowdown in those labor contracts, in those wages, in the capacity, right? Workers were an unavoidable part of the productive process. And that was why there was some balance between industry on the one hand and labor on the other. And you could have a fair negotiation, because it was unimaginable to have any piece of economic production without labor inputs. But when that labor became so expensive, because you didn't have the necessary levels of growth that you needed to sustain the quality of life that the post-war contract produced. And that was the storm of the 1970s. And again, by the time you eventually reach, 50 years after this financial epoch, pandemic, to me, pandemic illustrates, it does illustrate that the government can issue extraordinary political decisions. But it's also interesting that, like, why did pandemic cause the problems that it caused? Not just inflationary issues, but it also created, and, a financial crisis, but also created, extraordinary opportunities in the stock market, for instance. And this phenomenon of decoupling, right? The decouplement of the stock market from whatever was going on in the quote unquote real economy, because suddenly there was a downturn, there was the threat of recession, and markets went up, right? They expected another payout from government. So this is an illustration, in a sense, of how governments have worked, of how they organize the political will for the mobilization of the massive amounts of debt that we need for the financial system to work. So absolutely true to your point, the government and the financial system are very much on the same side in this most recent era. And creating a different government. Okay, a government of apps. What does that mean? Is it the government that makes apps, or is making apps with as a political decision, as a collective political project, the next step in what we have meant by government. You know what I mean? And therefore, the metric for me is not efficiency any more than when we look at the question of it, the internet and AI, the question is not really about efficiency. That shouldn't be. AI is about efficiency because, again, AI is about taking advantage of the public internet infrastructure and simply using it for the sake of getting that missing ingredient for our financial system, for our investments, for capital, for commercial activity. This missing ingredient, nobody can explain where it went, right? It's like a slowdown in the 1970s, just a slowdown. Well, of course, it was 2008. 2020 only made it more resolutely worse that we weren't going to change anything about the way the system operates. But the internet itself does not operate on the basis of this efficiency. And so, whatever version, again, of whatever collective project we build, from building the internet, for using apps as a medium, absolutely, for taking vital parts of our society and uploading them literally to the internet, yeah, that will be the important question, no doubt. The FCC, the Farm Credit Canada, has earmarked $2 billion for investments in agrotech innovations, things like, and I literally quote, robots that pick mushrooms, end quote. Which is sort of, this is the program, right? For let's use tech innovations. Like we've always used technology, right? It's always just making things quicker or making things easier. But I think this is a misunderstanding of technology. And I think actually this is another financialized move, because two things. One, there's this program of what's called, right, meaningful capital, that before you can have an industry, whether it's a food system, whether it's a healthcare system, there has to be some kind of movement of capital. There has to be investment interest. And that has nothing to do with the fact that we expect to make money on something. It has to do with the fact that our system is a primary debt system. Capitalism requires the surplus first, it requires the debt first. And then we engage in various forms of productivity, at the end of which we balance out. Um, but the problem is that, when you look at a food system, or yeah, if you look at healthcare, or again, any place where you might think actually you're going to use robots, there's a difficulty, when it's a public service, for trying to say, okay, we need capital to start this. And so we need the earmarked $2 billion. And actually, the $2 billion is, to borrow Carney's favorite phrase, just a catalyst for tens of billions of dollars in expected private investment, right?
Right.
So this is also the other political dimension, that we need the private sector to come in. At the same time as we're complaining, as we should be, about the $16 billion that the Canadian government spends every year on private consultants outside of the government. So it's funny that, we're willing to criticize the government when it does that, but we're happy in the other parts of our economy for private hands to come in. So we have some sense that maybe starting with capital is a slightly bonkers project. But there's also this question again of using robots to pick mushrooms. When a robot picks mushrooms, when we use technology, we can use technology in one of two ways, right? We can use technology to say increase yield, increase agricultural yield, the amount of mushrooms we're picking, come rain or shine. Who
Mhm.
cares about the underlying materialities that are there, the soil quality, or what, the seasonality? No, we don't. We're not interested in that. We sort of denatured ourselves, decoupled ourselves from the natural world. This is our concept of technology. But we could obviously imagine using robots to pick mushrooms for a completely different reason. You could build respectful robots, dare I
Mhm.
say,
Mhm.
robots that are interested in the materialities of the land. But you could only do that if you decouple technology from commercial activity. So we should not pretend, I think, that technology only ever means an improvement to capital, and that technology is the best friend of commercial activity. I think actually in the age of the internet, that's patently false.
Mhm. Well, that's what's interesting about, when you talk about the sort of the aspect of starting with capital that's so difficult, is that this almost feels like, um, I mean, obviously, like you said, this is $2 billion that are earmarked. So this feels almost like an attempt of, the partnership between government and private business. But this feels like them trying to do almost what we're suggesting, which is either sort of making apps or, making apps as a political tool, which is yeah, we know that people shouldn't be sort of picking mushrooms anymore in, whatever the society is. I mean, not, there's that book that was very popular in 2017 or 2016, The Mushroom at the End of the World, that kind of described how actually all of these people that were displaced now have become mushroom pickers. They lived in Vietnam. Fascinating, amazing, amazing, worth reading, incredible. But there's this idea that, okay, we don't people don't want to do this anymore, and if they do, they're going to be paid sort of a very low wage that can't support them. All of these elements, and so yeah, we need to figure out a way to do this cheaper, faster, higher yield. All of these things. Those are the qualities that we're going to start with. Whereas if you actually started with that, I mean, what's important there? Soil quality, maturation, will this be able to be harvested next year? How does this affect the ground 5, 10, 20, 25 years from now? All of these things. Um, that makes technology very, very different. And it's interesting because, in many cases, we actually did used to think these ways. I mean, this is sort of part of how even countries came to be. If you look at something like, the Netherlands, which was, a sea, um, once they had drained that sea, the soil was not very good. But they had some knowledge of how to plant crops that once they died, were able to fertilize the soil such that better crops could be planted in the next generation. And then those people planted crops that died and fertilized the soil in a specific way, such that the next generation could do that even better. Um, this to me is still technology. But it's not technology that exists in the way that we would think of it now, which, yeah, again, just sort of optimizes for our concept of efficiency and our concept of basically growth and return on investment. And so, you know, I think we're both probably in favor of mushroom picking robots, but like you said, sort of nice or respectful mushroom picking robots that sort of share values that we have been able to create and discuss in the political dimension.
Or if humans are going to do it, you need to maybe think about human work as distinct from its wage. You know what I mean? Or, there are ways in which human work can be not just fulfilling, but can be sort of genuinely, I would say, productive in
Mm,
an older sense of the word. Um, Again, we have to confront the excess of our food system. 60% of 70% of our food goes to feed livestock, and then there's 10% is food waste. We don't seem to eat quite as much as we think we do. We
mhm,
don't seem to operate at quite a scale as we think we do. Um, and obviously, our consumption contracts would change if we had different technology, but so would our wages. I mean, the internet utterly changes the information uh, that we input to understand mushroom picking, if that's something we want to do. Productively, thoughtfully, culturally, socially, even politically. But the internet also changes what wages mean. In fact, to some extent, they change what human work is. Wages as a way of pricing human work, which is a market-based way of describing work, would seem to go out the window a little bit. And this is a huge, very open question. How will the internet describe human involvement, human activity? Again, when you're working with the respect to commercial yields, the human is the last thing of importance. And even in some sense, the technology is the last thing of importance too. And no wonder, we've created, generations of extremely depraved conditions when it comes to the building of, say, modern industrial society. We have a very bad image of human work, and no less in a way than in the post-war period, when wages were working really well, and then wages as a technology collapsed. You know what I mean? And to an extent, you can move over to the entrepreneurial industry and say, okay, well, what happens when we choose our own prices and we're all masters of our own work? In some fictional sense, this is a nice segue out into the collapse of a social system and a socially reinforced system of wages. But as we can see, a private system of wages doesn't actually make any sense economically. Wages have to have some public dimension. They're a social technology. Otherwise, the wages can't really be effectively priced. And over time, your wage system, which it already really, in a sense, kind of has, will collapse. I mean, wages are reinforced by the things that we make. Wages are reinforced by the functionality of our debt system. Wages are reinforced by what government and private business does. Wages are reinforced by nature and its sustainability, its resiliency, its health, the thoughtfulness of the systems we've built. This latest turn into entrepreneurship is the only available icon for human work suggests to me that this is the last ditch attempt. Subjectivize wages, have each person choose what they think they're owed. The problem is it works for a very, very short period of time. You can't really coordinate across entrepreneurs a functional shared system of money, wages, taxes, revenue, or profit
Mm.
if everybody is choosing their prices independently or largely actually on the basis of yeah, returns on investment that are themselves just speculations with the assumption that the system works well, the tax system works well. We have uh, good, strong financial systems or good, strong work institutions. Uh, um, in other words, there's no actual contact between the financial industry and reality. And it's only a matter of time before this becomes apparent to society. And I think actually in so many ways it already has. What we lack is the democratic and political resolve to do something about it. Finally, some analysts are claiming that pension funds, Canadian pension funds, are underperforming because of private equity. And it's an interesting argument that pretty much they've been joined at the hip. Last 10, 15 years, private equity has surged and pension funds have surged, particularly in Canada. The majority of pension funds are investing in the United States. um, talking about American private equity firms to an extent. And the private equity model is very simple. They buy out a company that they can reliably, cut down, cut the workforce, cut any inessential things, and sort of like flipping a house. And then you can go back and sell it as an improved asset or however you want to describe it. And this is what private equity does. And they have to gather a certain amount of money, which often can come from things like pension funds, and then pension funds in a nice kind of reflexive circle that invest in more private equities
Mhm.
on the basis. So this is a system, right? Private equities need pension funds for capital, and pension funds need private equity firms for a very specific kind of business. And it's been an extraordinary business. In fact, it's perhaps one of the ultimate financialized businesses in our economy in the last 10 years or more, right? This I said earlier, this movement from conglomeration to conglomeration as a business in and of itself was very similar to private equities, right? The business has nothing to do with the underlying quality of the companies they're buying or the products that those companies make. It has to do with the model of cutting down, of introducing efficiency, right? Cutting any excess, selling it back. Well, the first question you have to ask is how can society handle this, right?
Mm.
What is the metric for what's essential and what's inessential, right? It all relies that there's some part of society that benefits from these companies being cut down, from them being slimmed.
Right.
But the truth is, because the entire economy seems to rely upon the commercial activity of private equities themselves, i.e., if private equities are healthy, the economy is healthy. And just as in the years leading up to 2008, don't look into the details. Don't actually look into whether private equity is at the end of the day contributing a meaningful form of optimization or efficiency to the underlying companies. What you'll generally find is those companies themselves are producing, sort of consumer products, consumer refinements that are also made on the basis that, say, private equity will succeed, that we have a strong financial system, that financialization will continue, that investments will be strong. So we're not going to think about anything outside of the domain of finance. So even the consumer products, which are organized by these companies that are owned by private equity, refer to private equity, or in a larger sense, refer to these giant capital stores like we have in our pension funds. So when private equity now finds its job very, very difficult, it's difficult to sell. People are not buying. Equity markets are struggling at the moment for so many reasons. This is partly to do with the Trump world. Pension funds, despite the fact that they're actually having still, I would say, excellent returns,
Mhm.
8-9%, um, are feeling the existential threat. I would say it has nothing to do with the numbers of the returns. It has to do with their reliance on on private equity, on this sort of cycle that we mentioned. That big stores of capital need people who can go in and clean up the economy, but it's completely self-referential.
Mhm. Well, I think also sort of what's really interesting is that the very sort of model of how private equity runs, this idea of optimization and of efficiency, is kind of self-defeating in an interesting way, and specifically with relation to the digital. Um, I think the very famous case sort of recently, I mean, there's one in Canada, which is the Hudson's Bay, which as of today or yesterday, depending on when this comes out, is no more. Um, but also Toys R Us was sort of the one that everyone had seen. How is it possible that Toys R Us is closing? This was a big thing. And so I guess I'll give a little bit of background on sort of oftentimes how private equity actually runs. And so what they do is, yeah, they do these things called buyouts, which is where they buy the company. But how it often works is what's called a leveraged buyout. So they take on incredible amounts of debt in order to buy the company. So in the example of Toys R Us, I think this was something like $5.5 billion that they borrowed from, yeah, big banks, JP Morgan Chase, and then also, yeah, pension funds, and other things. Um, and then what happens is, the private equity firm, let's say you and I, started one, the Radical Priorities private equity firm, which I hope it never comes to. But let's say we did that. We would then borrow that, $5.5 billion. Um, but then we wouldn't actually incur that debt. We would then place that debt on the Toys R Us, right? And so Toys R Us now we've been able to buy it because it was already failing. Now it's saddled with an incredible amount of debt. And then also as a private equity firm, or in order to make yourself money, while you're doing these things, you do basically force the corporation to pay you what are essentially management fees, right? To pay things like salaries and keep the private equity business afloat. Um, and so what ends up happening is that because you're sort of working against this debt, what you need to do is cut. What you need to do is cut, okay, and say, well, can we have 6 people on the showroom instead of 12? Which of course results in worse service. So even if you do have customers coming in, they might get worse service at a place where they're used to having an associate who can stand with them and talk through them and work through their budget and all these things. And you might cut, switching to a third party shipping agent instead of having a Toys R Us fleet of trucks and drivers who have benefits, who have, a union or something. Now you'll have Amazon run it, or some Amazon subsidiary, who has people who are working under, temporary foreign visas, who don't have proper training and who don't have access, who, have less wages, who do a worse job. So then your shipping becomes worse. All of these things. Um, and what ends up happening is, you'd think something like Toys R Us, you'd go, wow, brick and mortar store, they're failing because brick and mortar is kind of on the way out. They need to turn to the digital. They need to, figure out how to become more like an Amazon, more like an online retailer. But of course, that requires spending. That would require a whole new system of logistics and of shipping and of expansion. And private equity is not looking to do this. I mean, you're staring $5.5 billion in the face. You're not going to say, well, we need actually an additional billion to spend to, sort of bring us up to speed in the modern world. And so they also, this is the other thing, is that the digital in many cases is uncertain because we don't know necessarily what that would look like for them. It's very hard to predict. Whereas if you strip a company to very traditional things, like in the case of the Hudson's Bay, by the end of it, they were basically a real estate holding company. The stores didn't matter. What mattered was, the Hudson's Bay were massive department stores that often occupied a very, very central location. And so, what markets are able to tell from that is this piece of property is worth X amount of money because the company owns X amount of properties worth X amount of money. They're worth this much. They're really not looking for the revenue generation. And so, private equity in some cases is able to turn things around. And this was often, why it was seen as a successful business model was, very, very ruthless people come in, they cut things, they make it super efficient, and they turn it into a different kind of business, which then can potentially even be sold to a different private equity firm now that it's successful. And so the creditors, banks and pension funds, would get their money back. Nowadays, unfortunately, it seems like the trend is that that's just not possible, because now actually we need to spend in many cases, and we need to expand, and we need to get up to speed. Um, and so private equity, the entire business model in many cases has just become completely defeated. And the other issue is that, like I said, The private equity company itself, in many cases, does not actually incur the debt. They saddle the debt on the recently acquired business. And so when they default, they are defaulting on the pension fund and JP Morgan Chase. The private equity firm can often walk away with those management fees that it charged the company that it bought. Um, and default to their creditors, and basically walk away with a profit, whether or not the process was what we would call a success. And so, people in private equity firms themselves are not as intimately tied to this return on investment as we might think that they are. And so, yeah, I think it just speaks to the total failure of. It's like going back to tradition in the worst way possible. They just convert these things, like Hudson's Bay or like Toys R Us, into, yeah, effectively private holding companies, and then they sell off the assets. And now we're seeing that this business model doesn't really work anymore. What you'll end up with is a bunch of businesses that people think of when they think of their past and their childhood and have all these histories just completely shutter. And in the worst cases, it's often things like, hospitals, public hospitals, that completely fold and leave communities without access to healthcare. And so, I don't think either of us were in favor of private equity in the first place. But now it's something that just seems totally unsustainable and totally from a different time, basically.
Well, and in many ways, it's a method that emerged, I mean, maybe at its height, actually in the post 2008 world, but in an era, what they call, the era of free money, in which who cares if every part of the transaction is just the movement of debt, right? So you mentioned Hudson Bay. So, okay, if you have X amount of dollars valued, you can use that as collateral. You can use it as further leverage. No part of the transaction ever actually has to necessarily be be liquidated, which means, I can keep using my debt to then acquire more things, and the system is extremely circular in that sense. When a financial crisis tends to hit, it's because suddenly there is a need for there to be a kind of payout, or in the case, yeah, of private equity, the original lenders do expect a return of their own. What's sad with these original lenders, like pension fund, is that this is how we structure retirement, right? So the last part of our social security system, in some respects, the fact that we continue to pay into pension funds, is tied and has invested in, a business model that relies on taking easily available money and leveraging, as you said, massive amounts of debt and a debt system itself, not to contribute a meaningful form of efficiency or optimization. On the contrary, it seems as if when you want to point to this kind of critical degradation of service, of infrastructure all across, even though so much of it has been privatized for generations, right? You can point to, in some respects, the efforts and the behavior and the management strategies, et cetera, of private equity, because it's a difficult thing to point out. You know what I mean? It's not just, I think, this classic leftist trope about, capitalism is always concerning itself with the bottom line, or always looking to get that little bit more value out of the worker. On the contrary, I actually think the private equity has emerged in its most recent form as an attempt in the post 2008 world to desperately take advantage of the remaining assets, which were originally, again, we're going back to the 1970s to see the beginning of this story of taking these critical features of our system, privatizing them slowly, right? Whether it's, I mean, all kinds of things, part of your energy infrastructure, part of your telecommunications infrastructure, railways, you name it. And things, not all things, but many things, or parts of things, hadn't been privatized. But by the post 2008 period, and you've had this big financial crisis, you've run out of things, and you even run out of the debt itself to make a business off of, or you have in private equity the last stand of good debt. Um, it's a good explanation a little bit for why there've been none of those spendings, as you mentioned. The problem is, I think that we wouldn't have got to the point with private equity if the structure and technology of spending hadn't broken down in the first place. If money was, maybe we've reached a point where money, whether it's structured in taxes and revenue and wages and profits, isn't enough to structure human or social activity. It's not enough to structure and describe the world. Literally, it's not good enough. And debt, at the heart of that definitely isn't good enough because you run into these kinds of strange paradoxes. And by the time you reach the point where there isn't, because of the disinterest of the Trump administration and these forms of financialized business and the sort of shockwaves that have hit markets in terms of how predictable, right, are things in markets now? How much can we rely upon that people are going to continue to pay this or that, or that consumer markets will remain robust and resilient and inflation won't be too high? Nobody has answers to these questions anymore. Right? These were the staple markers of successful government, of successful economies, right? When you had control over these metrics. And it's so when your metrics start to break down, when they themselves are not just bad, but they don't work anymore to describe the situation, you know that you have a serious crisis on your hands, whether you recognize it or not.
This has been Radical Priorities, episode 31. I'm Ben Parkins.
I'm Nadine Clark.
Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.